Welcome to the Export to Japan podcast.
Export to Japan.
のポッドキャストへようこそ。
Bringing you the latest information on the Japanese market and doing business in Japan from the British Embassy in Tokyo.
For the web's richest resource for companies looking to do business in Japan, visit exporttojapan.jp.
And now, today's host, Steve Crane.
Today we are talking to Sue Kinoshita. Sue is a senior British diplomat who served as the Director of UK Trade and Investment in Japan, Deputy Head of Mission of the British Embassy in Seoul, and now, back in Japan, she is Minister Counsellor for Economic Affairs at the British Embassy in Tokyo. Sue gave us some great insight into her experience working here in Japan, including some very interesting examples of projects she's worked on here to help British businesses. We explored the details of the difference between tariff and non-tariff barriers, how these barriers have been changing over the years, and how we can think about barriers versus cultural issues. Sue was keen to let us know that the work her team does is not just for big multinationals, but that small to medium-sized enterprises can also benefit from getting in touch to see if Sue and her team can help. I hope you find the discussion useful. Hi Sue, welcome to the Export to Japan podcast. It's great to have you joining us today.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for the invitation. It's lovely to be here.
It's our pleasure. Yeah, good to have you on board. Now, I believe that this current stint that you have in Japan is this your third posting that you've had to Japan?
It depends how you count it. It's either the fourth or the fifth, actually.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And two of the jobs that I did were back to back. So
Right.
if you count that as one stint, then this is my fourth. If you count it as two separate postings, which it did feel like because one was in Osaka and one was in Tokyo, very different places, then this is my fifth
All right.
posting to Japan.
Very good. Well, I'm sure within those 4 or 5 postings you've had, there's a wealth of experience that you've picked up from your time here in Japan, and I look forward to probing into that and discussing a bit more about that with you on the podcast. But really, to get the ball rolling, I'd like to hear a little bit more from you about what you would consider to be one of your more memorable projects that you've worked on during your various periods here in Japan.
I think my most memorable project of all the jobs that I've done here actually revolved around the Football World Cup back in 2002, when we had to run a campaign to persuade the Japanese authorities and the Japanese public that they weren't about to be overrun by English hooligans. But that's probably not so relevant for export to Japan. So given the topic of our chat today, which is going to be about market access, let me pick something relevant to that, which is something that I worked on actually on my very first posting in Japan way back in the 1980s, when I was working on market access issues, of which there were many at that time, far fewer nowadays, I'm pleased to say. And it was a case involving chocolate-covered wafer biscuits. I won't mention the brand name, but it's something I think that most British people will have heard of. And the issue was that there were different tariff rates on chocolate products and on biscuits. Chocolate was more expensive than biscuits. And so the company was keen to bring it in as a biscuit rather than as chocolate, because then they could put it on sale at a lower price. But what was the definition of chocolate? What was the definition of biscuit? And we had tried all sorts of imaginative things to try to prove that it was a biscuit, including the well-tried trick of putting it in a cake tin, because it's well known, I think, that if you put a biscuit in a cake tin, it will go soggy. So we put it in a cake tin, and sure enough, it went soggy. So we went into the Ministry of Agriculture and said, look, we've proven it. It's a biscuit. It's not chocolate, which was a slightly unorthodox way of approaching the problem, I think, and didn't quite convince them. In the end, it turned out that there was actually quite a clear definition which depended on the thickness of the chocolate. And if it was no more than however many millimetres thick, then it was a biscuit. So we got the right answer in the end, but through a slightly more prosaic approach than the ones that we'd been trying.
Well, that's a wonderful example, and clearly some very creative thinking went into trying to work out how to get the best solution for that one. And I think that's actually quite a nice introduction to the work you do. So just to sort of expand on that a little bit, that reference was back to your early days in the 1980s. But could you just sort of, from a general point of view, just tell us a little bit more about the role of you and your team and your colleagues and what you really do on behalf of UK companies here in Japan?
Yeah, sure. I cover a lot of different areas in my current job, including science and innovation, energy policy, climate change, finance, economics, all sorts of areas. But again, sticking to the one that we're talking about here, my team also covers trade policy and market access. So it's all about creating the right environment for companies to be able to do business here. Particularly to export here or to set up shop here, but it does also translate into some of the issues that affect Japanese investors into the UK. On the trade policy side, we talk to the Japanese government about free trade agreements, regulatory dialogues, other ways of creating the right backdrop for companies to do business. And on the market access side, it's more about problem solving and looking at individual non-tariff measures or non-tariff barriers that are creating problems for UK companies who are trying to export to Japan. Once we hear about that kind of barrier, we will talk to the company and we will try, or to the sector as a whole, and try to figure out how we might be able to eliminate that barrier or lessen the barrier to make it easier for them to export to Japan.
Okay, now that is really interesting, and I want to explore that a lot more with you in a few minutes, because I see that as a key value point for our listeners here at Export to Japan. So we'll go on to that in a bit more detail in a moment, Sue. But before we dive into that, I just want to take you back to that period sort of in the 1980s when you were first here, and just really ask you a little bit more about, just from a very general level, what changes have you seen from those days of being involved in market access and trade back in the 1980s, bringing it up to date with where we are today? Just a few sort of general points on any differences that you notice from the point of view of UK companies coming into the market and some of the challenges they may face. Are there any particular differences you could highlight?
Yeah, I think it was a very different era in the 80s. It was the bubble era, and it was Japan as number one era, and everybody was thinking about Japan and interested in Japan, intrigued by Japan, without really knowing very much about it. But that meant that there was a sudden upturn in the level of interest in doing business with Japan to an extent that I don't think we'd seen before. And so the embassy and the trade team in particular in those days was very much involved in holding the hands of British companies who were making their first steps into the market, and for the most part finding it really difficult, because I think it's fair to say that in those days Japan was still quite protectionist in many ways. There were a lot of very explicit tariff barriers, quotas, that put imports at a disadvantage compared to their Japanese competitors. There were a lot of non-tariff barriers, some of them specifically, I think, targeting imports and trying to protect the Japanese industry, some of them completely unwitting, a lot of cultural differences that companies had not encountered before, which they sometimes tried to convince us were barriers, but we had to explain that no, it's just the culture, you just need to find a way of working with it. So there was a lot of exploring of what it meant to try to do business in Japan, and sort of sifting out what's really a barrier that we should be trying to break down, and what is just a cultural difference that you need to find ways of working with. By comparison, nowadays, I think there are still, for sure, barriers out there, but there are far fewer of them, and very few tariffs, very few quotas these days. And the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, which will be coming into force in February 2019, will gradually eliminate most of the remaining ones. Remains to be seen quite how the UK fits into that picture at the time of recording, but I think that is a good demonstration of the fact that Japan is very much on the same page as the UK in wanting a free and open trading environment, and being prepared to make sure that its own market is open as far as possible to foreign participants.
Very good. Yeah, that's good to hear. And I'm sure the good work that you've done over the years with your colleagues has contributed towards getting that different scenario these days. But it's certainly encouraging, I think, from the foreign company's point of view to know that things have moved in that direction that you're describing. So that's good to hear. Okay. Now, going back to some examples then, you've already shared with us a couple of interesting examples. The World Cup was one, and also the chocolate cake biscuit company as well was another fascinating one. Any other memorable ones that you've worked on over the years that you could share as sort of examples of things that you've been involved in for our audience?
Again, going back to the 1980s, I think the biggest campaign that we were involved in at that time was in trying to equalise the tax on Scotch whisky and other spirits to bring it more into line with the tax that applied to Japanese spirits, particularly shochu and sake. And at the time, there was a big differential, and it meant that foreign imported liquor products were a lot more expensive than the native Japanese ones. And that was clearly a big problem for our big whisky exporters in particular. That's the one that sticks with me, but I think gin and others were also involved. And we campaigned, lobbied over many years to try to bring about an equalisation in the tax rates, which was ultimately successful. And I think everyone can see now how successful that whisky industry has turned out to be, and our whisky exports to Japan are one of the most important products that we send over here. Interestingly, though, the immediate outcome actually of the levelling of the tax rates was a fall off in sales of whisky, and that was because people had used it very much as a gift product. And there's a custom in Japan, becoming much less common, but certainly was very prevalent then, of giving mid-year gifts and end-year gifts to your suppliers or to your children's teachers or your milkman or whatever. And when you received a gift, you were expected to reciprocate with one worth half the value of the one that you just received. And because everybody knew that a bottle of whiskey was worth X amount, they knew exactly how much to give you in return. And so when this tax came down and it gave companies more freedom to play around with their pricing levels, some products came onto the market really very cheaply, and then people got a bit confused because they weren't sure whether the gift they'd received was actually a really expensive one or a rather cheap one. So temporarily it had a rather unexpected consequence, but over time that played itself out, and now it's, as I say, one of our most successful export industries.
That's so fascinating and quite amusing. But I guess, as you say, it perhaps led to a different positioning of whiskey in the marketplace here, from perhaps being a premium product in the gift sector in a corporate world, perhaps to going a bit more mainstream to consumers buying it for everyday use. And I certainly echo your thoughts just from my observations being here in Japan, and going around the shops and the supermarkets and the liquor stores and in bars and restaurants. Whiskey is much more common now these days, so it's great to know that the results of your hard work back there in the 1980s. That's fascinating. Okay, these are wonderful examples, and I think for our audience this is a good insight into some of the stuff you've been involved in, and it might provoke some thoughts for the listeners from different sectors and different products to think about what this might mean to them. I mean, any others that come to mind while you're thinking this through, Sue?
Again, I'm going back to the 1980s because actually I haven't been directly involved in market access work since the 1980s. I've done a lot of other different things, but not so much market access. There were a lot of issues around food and drink products, and perhaps it's just those that stick in the mind because they're very accessible and familiar. But there was one company who exported boiled sweets to Japan and discovered, unfortunately only after all the bags of sweets had arrived at customs in Narita Airport, that the additive that they'd used in their green sweets was not permitted in Japan. So they had to go through and pick out all of the green ones and then repack them. And that was because Japan had a so-called positive list of additives. These are all the things that you're allowed to put into your product, whereas a lot of other countries at the time had a negative list. These are the things you're not allowed to include in your in your products. So it meant it was a very long process. Every time you wanted to export something to Japan, you had to check through the list. If the particular additive you wanted to use wasn't on their list, you then had to make a case to have that additive added to the list, which of course in any industry which is innovating rapidly is really difficult, because you've got new products coming out, new ingredients, new materials, and a positive list means that you've then got to make the case to put them onto the list. Whereas if it's a negative list, something only gets onto the list if it's known to be harmful or in some way, whether it's to the user or to the environment or whatever. So that led to a campaign to try to persuade Japan to adopt more negative lists rather than positive lists.
Okay, amazing examples.
Can I mention one more?
Of course, please do. They're fascinating, yes.
Which, this is a rather different one, although it still involves animals, and that is bovine semen.
Okay.
Was I hadn't learnt the vocabulary that related to that when I did my Japanese language training, but I had to learn it very quickly when we realised that there was a big demand in Japan for British bovine semen to help them to develop their own livestock industry. And in order to begin that, there needed to be a set of rules in place. There needed to be tests to show that the bulls were healthy and so on and met the standards required. And so one of my very first jobs actually was to negotiate an agreement with Japan for the export of British bovine semen, liaising between the ministries of agriculture in each country to get the conditions for that right. So that was slightly unusual, shall we say, but very much welcomed by the Japanese livestock industry once we put it in place. And I remember the signing ceremony with two ministers. Slightly odd, but important to those who needed the product. Unfortunately, a few years later, there was the outbreak of BSE in the UK.
Oh, yes.
And so exports stopped again.
Right.
Cows generally have been a big theme of our market access work over the years, because, of course, that's also affected exports of beef and also of bovine extracts.
Yeah, well, that's another amazing story, but I think what it does demonstrate is the wide variety of topics and subject areas and different sectors and different industries that you've clearly got involved in. And again, I think for our audience of listeners out there, it might be very thought-provoking for them to think more about how you may be able to support in the future. And we'll come on to that in a moment. One thing I just wanted to pick up on at this point, Sue, I've heard you mention a couple of times two different phrases, tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers. And I don't want to make the assumption that we all know exactly what that is. So could you just give us a brief overview of the difference between those two pieces of terminology, please? What do they mean?
So a tariff barrier is an extra financial cost that is explicitly put onto imported goods. So there might be a 10% tariff on all imports of cheese. Let's stick with the food and drink example, for example. And it's very transparent. You can see how much it is, you know how much it is, and you know what you're going to have to do to get your product into the market. Non-tariff barriers are much more subtle and much more varied, and they can include things like standards, which perhaps vary from one place to another. It can include particular regulations that need to be complied with. It can include any measures really that are put in place that might have some kind of impact on the amount of product that can come to market or the price at which it can come to market. And very often these non-tariff measures, as we'd say, are actually quite legitimate. So they might be necessary for preserving public health, for example, or for environmental reasons. You don't want to bring in products that are clearly going to be unsafe or detrimental to the environment. Or it is often regarded as legitimate to put measures in place to protect an infant industry. That's probably less relevant for a developed market like Japan, but in certain developing markets it's regarded as legitimate to put in place non-tariff measures that will just protect a growing industry until it's ready to compete on a more even playing field. And the criteria around that are that any such measures should be transparent, they should be science-based, and they should be no more restrictive than is necessary. So often non-tariff measures are completely legitimate. Sometimes they're not. If it tips over into being something that discriminates between domestic and international companies, or perhaps discriminate between different WTO member countries, then you're tipping over into something that we'd call a non-tariff barrier. So it's not just a measure, it's a barrier. And that's where we might decide that we needed to step in to try to eliminate the barrier. So they can be very technical, as some of those that we've already discussed around sort of animal health or plant health measures. There could be particular customs processes that are stipulated which can make life difficult for imported products. There might be particular labelling requirements, which again can be legitimate. You need to make sure consumers know what is in the product that they're about to buy, if they've got an allergy, for example. But sometimes they can be more restrictive than is necessary and add extra cost into a product for the supplier, and that's when it perhaps tips over into becoming a barrier. You might find that there are domestic policies that have the effect of discriminating against foreign products, for example, subsidies to domestic producers. Or there might be rules that say we will only accept your product as a British product if over 70% of the content has come from the UK. And obviously with international supply chains these days, that becomes quite complex and quite difficult to track. And sometimes companies will just say it's just not worth the effort of trying to prove it, so we won't bother. So it can end up being an impediment to trade. So they come in all sorts of different shapes and forms. The ones that are most commonly cited by companies, not just in Japan but globally, are standards that differ from international norms, local licensing arrangements that differ from international norms, taxes, tariffs, as we've talked about, and intellectual property protection issues. Again, there's a myriad of pitfalls out there. And again, Japan is on the whole pretty good now about protecting intellectual property, but that's not the case in all markets. And there will still be companies who come up against issues with their trademarks or their patents or other intellectual property.
Right, got it. And should I assume from the way you're talking through those examples and explaining that to us, the work, again, that you and your team do and your colleagues, it doesn't really matter from your perspective whether it would be regarded as a trade barrier, as a tariff barrier or a non-tariff barrier. You're willing, if the case is right and if you think you can make a change, you will help a UK company in either scenario.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and
okay.
the way in which you go about tackling it may be different. But yes, if it's a barrier to trade, then we want to know about it and we would want to try to do something about it.
Okay. Hearing you describe them actually reminded me of a discussion I had with a really innovative UK company just a few weeks ago. And this particular company were looking to do business here in Japan around the Olympics in 2020, not too far away now. And they, to cut a long story short, they were involved in the 2012 Olympics back in the UK, and they have a sort of particular piece of know-how and a service and a technology around crowd control and crowd measurement. And they felt that there was an opportunity to perhaps help over here with 2020. And on the surface of it, what they were explaining to me was that it looked like all the contracts and the tenders were open for international companies to be able to tender. But when they drilled down into some of the nitty-gritty of the requirements for the companies that were tendering, I think I'm right in saying that it mentioned that one of the criteria was you had to have a project manager on your team who had over 5 years' experience of working in Japan on similar projects. And their argument to me was basically saying, look, how on earth can a foreign company from the UK fit that criteria? So would that be sort of an example of a non-tariff barrier, what you might consider to be?
I don't know who was letting that contract, but it sounds as though that was probably a public procurement issue.
It was.
And yes, absolutely, that is a very live issue, not just in Japan, but in a lot of other places too. And you're right, government procurement, it's a big market. The governments are some of the biggest spenders anywhere in major infrastructure projects, but also in other ways, whether it's products to use in schools or in hospitals or whatever. So making sure that foreign companies have access to those opportunities is really, really important. But it is one of the most difficult areas to tackle. And you're right, it will be open in theory, but in practice, when you look at some of the requirements, like having to have a local partner, for example, or having to have pre-registered as a preferred supplier, and the paperwork and the processes you have to go to be able to do that, it's not impossible, but it does make it very, very difficult and tends to tilt the playing field in favour of local players. So yeah, absolutely, that is a barrier, and one that we actively talk to the Japanese government about, both central government and local government. They are big spenders.
All right, very good. One other topic I wanted to pick up with you on, and again, I'm thinking back to some of the examples, the interesting examples you gave us. Now, I'm putting myself in the shoes of a small to medium-sized enterprise there, but back in the UK, that are perhaps thinking about coming into the Japanese market. You gave the really interesting example of the boiled sweet company, and I think you mentioned that they'd already got their product here to Japan before they realised some of those problems that you highlighted. Now, is there a way that you would give advice to potential exporters back in the UK of how they could go about trying to find out if there may be barriers, non-tariff or tariff barriers, before they actually take action? Is there a way they can start to explore that and learn more about that? Or what's your advice?
There is. It's not to be undertaken lightly if you're a small company, because it's pretty complex. And I think that's actually where people like Export to Japan and the embassy can come in, because we recognise that it's not easy for a small company to go and pour through all the WTO tariff schedules, for example, or government websites to find out what the requirements are for any given product. So large companies will probably have some kind of compliance team that can do that research. Small companies almost certainly won't have the resources to be able to do that. The people in our teams here in the embassy who are helping British exporters are experts in their specific sectors, and as part of that they do know what the rules and regulations are, or they can find out and can try to help companies to understand what requirements they will have to meet, and then the company can decide whether they can easily meet those, or whether actually complying with those requirements would be too cumbersome or too time consuming or too expensive, and therefore they'll go and look elsewhere, or whether it is expensive, but actually this is potentially a really big market, so we'd love to try, but we're going to need some help first of all in overcoming some of these barriers, at which point my team can step in and try to help.
Excellent. Really good. Okay. What we'll do as we sort of get towards the end of the podcast, let's make sure we're letting everybody know the channels of how they can reach out and contact. So we'll come onto that towards the end of the podcast. But it's just great to know that support and help is there, because I can just imagine that scenario of if you start going ahead with your export plans and you get your product here and it gets to customs and the docks, and then you find out there's a problem. That's not a great place to be. Is it?
You really don't want to be there. I think the other point to mention is that sometimes it's a fine dividing line between what constitutes a barrier and what is actually just part of the business environment or part of the culture, and which are much harder to deal with, and some arguably you shouldn't be trying to change. So, for example, in the business environment, you might talk about the labour market in Japan, which is pretty inflexible. Once you've hired someone, it's pretty difficult then to get rid of them again. Now, some people might say that is a barrier to market entry. I'm not sure that it is. It might be a bit of a disincentive, but it's something that applies to local companies as much as it applies to foreign companies, and it's part of the business environment. It's something we do lobby on for sure, because we do see it as inhibiting innovation and agility, not just amongst British companies, but in the Japanese economy as a whole. So we do engage with the Japanese government on that, but it's perhaps not so much a market access barrier per se. And then it gets even more sensitive, I suppose, when you start looking at cultural issues. So, for example, financial services companies might bemoan the fact that in Japan there is an overriding preference for liquid assets, and that means it's quite hard for them to sell some of their products. Now, maybe there is a job to be done to educate Japanese investors or savers that they can get better returns if they're prepared to take a few more risks. But ultimately, that is a cultural preference, and it's quite hard to say that the British government should be marching in and telling people they've got to do things differently. So there's always that judgment to be made as to whether this is a valid thing to be taking up or not.
That's a great point, and that makes perfect sense what you're describing there. So yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I think that's a really important point. Okay, I'd like to move on a little bit. I think we're getting a really good flavour of some examples of things you've worked on in the past and what it really means to be doing what you're doing. But I'm actually curious to know a bit more about how you actually do it. What is the day-to-day activity that you would do to try and support international companies coming in and get tariffs changed and get barriers changed and lobby governments? I mean, how do you do it? What's your day-to-day job, Sue? What do you do to get this change?
It's all about influencing people, really, and the starting point is, first of all, just to check, have we understood this correctly? Are we interpreting it correctly? So sometimes it's just a matter of going and talking to the relevant ministry or to the customs office or whoever and just saying, we think this is what the rule is saying. Can you clarify that for us? Have we interpreted it correctly? So that's the sort of baseline level. But once you've decided that there is a problem and there is a barrier and you want to do something about it, then you need to devise your influencing campaign to get it changed. And usually that's about lobbying. So it's going in to see the relevant ministry or regulator or standard setter and explain to them why this is a problem, why it would be good for Japan to change it. Perhaps if it's an industrial product, maybe the companies need it in order to improve input into their own products or services. If it's a consumer product, maybe it's about consumer choice or safety or whatever. So it's first of all, it's lobbying those who own the rules and regulations and or whatever, and trying to persuade them that would be in Japan's interests to change them. Or perhaps it's just that they're out of step with the rest of the world. It's adding cost to businesses to have to comply with these regulations, and it means that, for example, Japanese patients are not getting early access to innovative medicines. So that's the basis of it. Very often we will do that in conjunction with other stakeholders. It may be that there are other countries who've got similar issues. So we've often tied up, for example, with the Americans or the Australians on legal services because they have also big legal sectors and similar problems. It may be that it's an industry-wide issue. It's not just one company, it's the whole industry. And then you can get trade associations involved also in making the case. There might be an element of appealing to the public about it, in which case you go out and look for friendly journalists or people who've been affected adversely by the policy so that they can talk about it. It's always good to have advocacy from neutral third parties rather than it always being the British government or the company themselves who've obviously got a vested interest in resolving this. So finding other actors who can come in to support your case or to argue your case for you is always a very effective approach. There are then other more formal ways of trying to resolve some of these issues. It might be that you want to work towards a regulatory dialogue. I think that's particularly relevant in some of the more innovative sectors, digital, healthcare, robotics, AI, for example, where there currently aren't any rules, or we're making up the rules, and or the ISO or the WTO or whoever is currently drawing up the rules for international trade in these areas. And if we can establish a bilateral dialogue with Japan in that, then we can influence that international debate and try to make sure that the new regulations and standards that are put in place work for our companies. So that's another approach. There might be a place for a free trade agreement. The UK was one of the main proponents of the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, which will be coming into effect in February. And that was a very good way of tackling particularly tariff barriers, but also some of the non-tariff barriers and some other areas like trade in services or investment protection. And it could be that is a very formal free trade agreement is the best mechanism for bringing together some of the bigger issues that we want to see opening and liberalisation. The ultimate recourse, I suppose, is the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. I don't have any experience of that, and I think you need to be quite determined and probably have pretty good resources behind you if you're going to go down that path. But that is an option, or of course legal action, particularly in the case of infringements of intellectual property. So a number of different tools and approaches that you can take, and it's a question of looking at the specific barrier, the specific issue, and deciding what's going to work best in this case.
Okay, that's wonderful. Okay, with a very good explanation. Now, that provokes another thought. Hearing you talk through that, and also thinking about some of the examples you shared of this a little earlier, one thing that I find quite enlightening here is one might assume that this kind of lobbying and pushing back on trade barriers and trying to get change in barriers, all this stuff is just for the really big guys, the big corporations, the big sort of oil companies or pharmaceutical companies. You know, one might think it's just for that world, but actually what I'm picking up a little bit from this discussion is it doesn't just apply to those guys. And of course, a good proportion of our listeners here at Export to Japan are more in the category of the small to medium-sized enterprises. So, you know, again, could you give us a comment on that, about how it might apply to smaller companies and how they could perhaps benefit from some of the support that you could offer?
Yeah, absolutely. It applies to small companies as well as big ones. And of course, it's even harder for them either to investigate or to tackle these barriers because they just don't have those resources. But also because it's the extra cost. You see, it all comes down to cost. Complying with particular standards or regulations takes time and money, and that adds to your costs. And again, an SME is much less able to absorb that than a bigger company. So we would very much want to try to help small companies as well as big ones. There always, of course, has to be a prioritisation exercise that goes on. We can't do everything, so we would want to look at specific cases and decide, is this something that actually is significant enough that we do feel we should take it up at government level? Is it something that's affecting a lot of companies as opposed to just one? Is it something that is reasonably easy to resolve? Or is it actually going to require a sustained campaign, possibly over many years, in which case we really need to be clear that there's going to be a very strong benefit from it at the end of the process. So a number of factors come into play, but certainly we would want to try to tackle problems raised by SMEs as much as those by the big companies.
Okay, that's really great to hear, and yeah, very, very good to know that that you're willing to consider that and have that wide range of consideration for all sorts of companies, albeit acknowledging the sort of criteria that you work through, which makes perfect common sense. Okay, so if we take it on a stage further, then let's look at the service that you offer. I mean, is this service, if one of our companies listening in here contacts you and you go through the evaluation and you have a look at it and you think, yes, there could be a case here where we could help, is that a service that they pay for, or is that a free service? How does that bit work, Sue?
Oh, that's a tricky question. On the whole, though, we would not charge for market access work because it's not a problem of the companies making. It's not sort of an optional extra. It's a key part of their ability to do business here, and it is a government to government discussion. So on the whole, we would do that free of charge. Certainly if it was something that were affecting a whole sector or a whole range of companies. So government procurement actually is a good example. That affects companies across a whole range of sectors. So we would want to tackle that as a phenomenon rather than as a single company issue. There may be cases where if it's a single company issue, we might say that, look, we need to be completely sure that you are as invested in this as we are. So we might possibly ask for companies to pay for that. But I can't actually think of a recent example of where we have done that.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, that's fair enough, and that's something I guess you could deal with on a case-by-case basis as companies come in and approach you. And
I certainly wouldn't want to put companies off reporting barriers that they've come across because they might be worried about the cost of doing so. Because we'll want to look at it, and if we don't know about a barrier, we can't do anything about it. I think that's one of our challenges at the moment. There are companies who are already in market, who are doing business, but who would like to be able to do more business. And they come to us quite readily to tell us about the issues that they've encountered. And there are perhaps trade associations who are very active. And so we will work with them. But we don't know what we don't know. So,
that's a great point.
And it may well be that there's a big untapped market here, which companies are just not bothering with because they've taken a look and they thought, no, that looks too difficult. There's this standard which is completely out of kilter with everything else that we do around the world, so we won't even bother. If we know about it, then maybe we can do something about it. So I would really encourage companies to let us know.
Yes, okay. Well, again, that's really refreshing to hear, and it's good that you get that message out to our audience. So, it sounds like the door is open for companies to approach you and at least let you know of the issues they're facing and the challenges. We know, obviously, you've got only a limited resource, so you have to prioritize, and you can't argue everybody's case. And you sort of explain the criteria that you would look at. So I guess the process should be that companies should reach out to you if they feel it's something they should be making you aware of, and it might be something that you could help with. You will then put that through your criteria and work out if it's something you feel you can help with, and you'll go back to those companies and just let them know if it's something that you can support.
I think we would probably go back to the company straight away anyway, just to make sure that we've understood the extent of the problem and the nature of the problem. So yes, we would want to do that. Right now, if people have those issues, be very glad to hear from them, whether that's directly to the embassy or via export to Japan. Either route is fine. Yep. There is work going on at the moment to create a database, an online database, which companies will be able to both access to see what issues others have identified in different markets around the world. This is a global database, not just for Japan. And have a look at that and get a sense of, this, for my particular product, it looks as though there are all sorts of problems in the Middle East or wherever, or America, so we won't go there. But also to enable them to register any problems that they've come across. So that will be, in due course, another route. If you've perhaps got issues in lots of different markets, that could be a quicker way of registering rather than contacting lots of different embassies around the world.
Okay. I know you said that sounds like it's something that's under development at the moment. At this point, do you have any idea on the timeline of when that may or may not be available, or is that...
No, I think the intention is for it to go live during 2019, but I can't be any more precise than that. But
I'm sure when it's ready...
Neither can I give a name for it or say where it will be hosted, so I'm conscious that is probably not a particularly useful piece of information to be putting out there, but there will be a campaign to draw attention to it once it goes live, and I imagine we could publicise that through export to Japan.
Cool. Yes,
so look out for more news on that in future.
Yeah, great. Okay. Well, I think it's been a great discussion, Sue. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I think it's been very, very enlightening. Some fascinating examples that you've shared with us, but I think they are very thought-provoking in terms of helping companies realise that the breadth of the work that you've done over the years and the different topics that you've covered and different areas that you can work on. It's also been so fascinating to know that this isn't just something for the big guys. The smaller companies too should not feel shy about raising their voice and getting their message out and reaching out to you. So that's encouraging to know as well. And it's good to understand a bit more about the mechanism of how it all works and what you do and how you achieve those objectives. So I think really it's over to you good people out there listening now. If this discussion with Sue has triggered some thoughts, and if you feel with your particular industry or your service or your product, if there are some areas where some of these barriers may be preventing you from achieving your goals and your objectives, then think carefully about it and look to reach out to Sue and her team. And as Sue has kindly said, she welcomes those inquiries from you, and she will have a look at them. Her and her colleagues will get back to you and let you know if it's something that they think they can support you with. It will be, in terms of how to get in touch, as Sue mentioned, you can reach out to her and her team. I'm sure if you do Googling, you'll be able to find out where to get through to the embassy directly or contact Sue, or indeed, by all means, come in through Export to Japan. So you can use the email address info@exporttojapan.co.uk, or there are several points on the website where you can just click a button and send your inquiry in. So feel free to put your inquiries through to us that way as well, and we will forward those on to Sue and her colleagues. So I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. Thank you so much for listening in, and it just finally, it's time for me to thank you, Sue, for giving up your time and coming and joining us today and sharing some of those wonderful stories. It's been great to talk with you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue. Thank you.
If you'd like more information about exporting to Japan or the Japanese market in general, visit exporttojapan.jp. If you have a question for us, send it to info@exporttojapan.exporttojapan.exporttojapan.exporttojapan.exporttojapan.export